An elderly man walks into a high-end store, asking for prices on everything, and the staff's judgment is written all over their faces. But what happens next will leave you speechless. When he pulls out cash to buy everything, the store, and everyone inside it, comes to a screeching halt. What does he know that they don't? And why is this moment about more than just money? Stay tuned, because this story is about to change everything you thought you knew about value, respect, and the price of appearances. Mr. Solomon Carter walked into the boutique as if he had all the time in the world. His steps were measured, deliberate, the faint tapping of his cane punctuating the otherwise silent atmosphere. The store had that familiar sterile, polished air, a gleaming showcase of luxury that seemed both out of place and oddly comforting. The racks were lined with expensive coats, watches, and scarves, each item hanging like a prize waiting to be claimed. It was a place where people came to be seen, not to actually buy anything. He knew this. He had walked into enough of these kinds of places in his life, seen the way the salespeople looked at him, the way the other customers looked at him, as though his presence were an inconvenience, or worse, a joke. Solomon had never been one to care about appearances. He had lived too long to be concerned with how others saw him. At 82, he had seen the world change in ways that left most people breathless. Yet he had remained unchanged, anchored by the wisdom of experience. His coat, a worn but well-maintained brown wool, was nothing compared to the sleek, high-end materials on display. But there was something in the way he moved. His posture straight, shoulders back, cane a mere formality. Something that made the young clerks in the store notice, even if they didn't know why. Tasha, a sales associate who had been working at the store for just over 2 years, looked up from behind the counter as the old man shuffled in. She barely registered his appearance at first. He was just another old customer who would ask too many questions and never buy anything. Still, her eyes lingered for a moment longer than usual. He didn't look like he belonged in a place like this. His face, lined with years of life, didn't carry the polished look of the usual clientele. People in their 30s and 40s who wore their wealth like a second skin. And though he had a calmness about him, there was something in the way he held himself that suggested more than just the tiredness of age. It was as if he had seen things that made him unafraid of their judgment. Tasha let out a small sigh and went back to scrolling through her phone. She didn't have time for the likes of him. She was trying to juggle too much in her life, and this dead-end job was just another chain around her ankle. But Mr. Carter didn't seem to notice her disinterest. He walked slowly through the aisles, his fingers brushing lightly against the fabrics, as though he was savoring the touch of something rare. Occasionally, he stopped to examine an item in more detail, as if each piece held a story, a memory, just waiting to be discovered. After a while, Tasha finally grew tired of watching him drift around the store and decided to approach. She had the familiarity of someone who'd been working retail for too long, polite, but with an underlying impatience, ready to steer customers toward the register with the hope of making a sale. "You need help with something, sir?" she asked, her voice casual but with a touch of condescension. "Anything catch your eye?" Mr. Carter looked up at her, his eyes warm but distant, as if seeing more than just her. "Yes," he said slowly, his voice deep, measured. "I was wondering how much the coat on the far rack costs." Tasha glanced over at the coat he was referring to. It was a luxurious fur-lined parka that was well out of reach for most people, let alone an elderly man like him. She hadn't even noticed it until now, but her eyes narrowed slightly when she saw which item he was looking at. "Another one of these types," she thought a little bitterly. "That's one of our more exclusive pieces," she said, the words feeling almost rehearsed. "It's $1,500, sir." There was a pause. Mr. Carter didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He simply nodded as if the price were just another small piece of information in a world full of it. "I see," he said. "And the scarves next to it? How much are they?" Tasha felt a small pang of irritation. Doesn't he know anything? She could see how it might look to him, an elderly man who probably had no idea what these things cost, asking questions that were a little too specific, a little too insistent. She'd seen it 1,000 times before, older folks who seemed to wander into stores just to fill their time, perhaps a little too proud to admit they couldn't afford what they were admiring. Those, she said, snapping out of her judgmental thoughts, run between $200 and $400, depending on the fabric. Mr. Carter took a step closer to the scarves, examining them for a moment, the way someone might look at something they'd seen 1,000 times before. Quite expensive, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Tasha, feeling the weight of his gaze but not fully understanding its meaning, shifted her weight. Yes, well, she said with a forced smile. That's what you get with high-end brands, you know, exclusivity. Mr. Carter turned to her then, his gaze direct, but not unkind. I've lived a long time, he said, his tone quiet, almost gentle. I've seen many things. You'd be surprised what people spend money on when they don't know the price of dignity. The words hung in the air for a moment. Tasha didn't know how to respond. Was he talking about something deeper than just money? She wasn't sure, but there was something in his voice, something weighty that made her pause. Just then, Ethan, the store manager, appeared from the back, his sharp suit making him look as if he had stepped out of a magazine. His face was tight with the stress of the day's sales targets, but his demeanor was one of barely contained irritation. He took in the scene, the old man lingering over the scarves, Tasha standing a little too far from the counter, and immediately moved in with the calculated precision of a manager who thought he had all the answers. Everything all right here? Ethan asked, though his gaze was already on Mr. Carter, sizing him up. Tasha straightened slightly. He was just asking about the prices. Ethan gave Mr. Carter a glance, his eyes flicking up and down in judgment. There was a momentary silence before he spoke, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. Sir, you're looking at some of the more exclusive pieces. If you're interested in something more affordable, we have plenty of options. I'm not concerned with affordability, Mr. Carter interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Ethan pause. I'm concerned with the price people pay for things that can't be measured by money. Ethan blinked, slightly taken aback, though he quickly regained his composure. Of course, he said, a tight smile forming on his face. If you need anything else, feel free to ask. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun, and Ethan moved off, clearly eager to return to the real work of running the store. Tasha, still feeling the weight of Mr. Carter's words, watched him for a moment longer before shaking her head and turning back to her phone. Mr. Carter, however, didn't seem to notice the subtle dismissal. He simply moved on, his cane tapping softly on the floor as he continued his exploration. He had not come here to buy, but he had certainly come here to teach. The hours dragged on, the day stretching into an endless cycle of questions and half-hearted interactions. The store, though empty of genuine enthusiasm, was brimming with superficial energy, customers who wandered in out of habit, employees who were there only for the paycheck. No one seemed particularly invested in anything, save for the distant hum of the store's fluorescent lights and the soft chime of the door every time another customer walked in or out. Tasha, slumped behind the counter, was barely paying attention to her surroundings. Her thoughts were consumed by the text she had received earlier from her landlord, demanding rent money she didn't have, and the text from her ex, who had been persistently asking for a second chance. Neither matter was resolved by scrolling through Instagram, but it was all she could do to escape the reality of her life. Mr. Carter, however, remained a steady, unspoken presence throughout the store. He moved slowly, without urgency, inspecting each display with the quiet reverence of a man who knew the value of things, whether those things had a price tag or not. He wasn't interested in shopping, not really. There was something about the way he lingered over the merchandise, his hand barely grazing the edges of a silk scarf, or his eyes flicking over the tags on expensive watches, that made Tasha feel uncomfortable. It wasn't just the questions about prices. It was the way he moved, the way he spoke. It was the way he seemed to see through the store, through the sales pitch, through the pretense. He never hurried. He never complained. There was a sort of quiet defiance in his movements, as though he was making a statement without needing to say a word. It was a stark contrast to how everyone else moved. Ethan, the manager, was pacing in the back office, his face lined with frustration. The day's sales were slipping further than he had expected, and the corporate call looming over his head was like a shadow that stretched across every decision he made. His stomach churned with the knowledge that if he didn't hit certain targets, he could lose his job, and worse, the store could close. The pressure was mounting, and he hadn't even finished his third coffee of the day. He emerged from the office, rubbing his temples, and immediately spotted Mr. Carter still wandering near the coat racks. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The elderly man had been in the store for hours now, asking questions, but not buying a thing. If this continued, he'd have to kick him out. There was no place for people like that in a store like this, not if they weren't going to make a purchase. But as he moved toward Mr. Carter, he was interrupted by a phone call from corporate. Ethan answered with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, masking his annoyance with practiced charm. "Hello, Mr. Mallory," Ethan said, his voice forced. "Yes, we're pushing some sales today. We're working on it." Tasha, hearing his tone, couldn't help but roll her eyes. She hadn't been in the store long enough to understand the full weight of Ethan's struggle, but it was obvious that he was barely holding it together. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter hadn't moved from his spot near the coat racks. He was staring at a wool coat, his eyes distant, as though seeing something else entirely. The price tag read $1,500, a number that would make anyone but the wealthiest hesitate. Tasha couldn't help but watch him. She had been rude to him earlier, but something about the way he studied the coat intrigued her. He wasn't behaving like a typical customer. He didn't seem embarrassed by the price, didn't flinch at the extravagance of it. Most people, in her experience, would have at least pretended to be disinterested by now. Yet here he was, unmoved, staring at it with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She felt herself drawn to him again, an instinct she couldn't quite explain. She stood up, brushing the strands of hair out of her face, and walked over. "You still looking at that one?" she asked, trying to mask the awkwardness of the situation with a smile. Mr. Carter didn't immediately respond. He didn't even acknowledge her presence for a few seconds. When he did, it was as though the air in the store had shifted. His eyes met hers, deep, steady, and unblinking. "It's a fine coat," he said quietly, his voice tinged with something almost like sadness. "But it's not the coat that matters, is it?" Tasha blinked, taken aback by the question. "I'm not sure I understand," she said, though she immediately regretted her words. He wasn't asking about the coat in the same way a typical customer would. He wasn't interested in its brand or its features. He was speaking about something else entirely. "It's the price, isn't it?" Mr. Carter continued, still looking at the coat, his voice barely above a whisper. "The price they charge for things you can't wear, things that won't give you warmth when you need it most." Tasha felt a ripple of unease. She didn't know how to respond. Her own struggles, her debt, her broken relationship, her sense of being stuck in a life she hadn't chosen, flashed through her mind. The coat was just a thing, a symbol of something unattainable. It wasn't warmth, not the kind that would heal her. It wasn't security, not the kind she was desperate for. "I'm sorry," she said finally, unsure if she was apologizing to him or to herself. "I don't think I understand what you mean." Mr. Carter smiled, but it wasn't a smile that carried comfort. It was something else, something that felt more like a burden. "I didn't expect you would," he replied softly. "Not yet." Before Tasha could respond, the store's doorbell chimed as another customer entered. The atmosphere in the store shifted once again, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from Mr. Carter's shoulders, and the casual transactional air returned. He gave Tasha a nod, as if dismissing the moment, and turned to leave. But as he walked out of the store, his cane tapping softly on the floor, he paused at the door. He turned back to Tasha, his eyes briefly locking with hers. "Don't let the price of things make you forget your own value," he said, before stepping out into the street, leaving her standing there, unsure of how to process his words. For a moment, the store felt quieter, the silence stretching out longer than it had all day. Tasha stared at the spot where he had stood, her mind racing. She didn't know why his words had unsettled her so much, or why, for the briefest of moments, she had felt as though she might have understood exactly what he meant. But she didn't, not yet, and that bothered her more than she cared to admit. The days that followed seemed to blur together, like the slow turn of a page in a book that never quite moved forward. Tasha tried to shake off the unease Mr. Carter's words had stirred in her, but they lingered, like an itch she couldn't scratch. She went through the motions, greeting customers, answering questions, occasionally folding clothes, but her mind was never fully there. She found herself watching for his return, scanning the door whenever it opened, half expecting him to walk back in, cane tapping against the floor, to offer more cryptic wisdom. But he didn't. What bothered her wasn't just that he hadn't come back. It was the fact that she wanted him to. Something about the way he saw the world. Something about the way he carried himself. It felt like a reminder that there was more to life than the transactional, shallow surface that consumed her. She had always thought of herself as someone who just needed to get through the day. But after that brief exchange with Mr. Carter, she began to wonder if there was more to it than just surviving. The store, on the other hand, continued its downward spiral. Ethan's stress levels hit new highs, the corporate calls getting more frequent, the sales figures more dismal. He had taken to spending more time pacing the aisles, adjusting the displays, trying to give the illusion that things were fine when everything around him felt like it was falling apart. The truth was, he was drowning, and he knew it. He had seen it happen to other stores before, watched them buckle under the pressure of an unforgiving market, and it was only a matter of time before his own store followed suit. His performance reviews had been mediocre at best, but now, with the company's impending audit hanging over him, he could feel the walls closing in. One afternoon, as Tasha was arranging a rack of scarves, luxury brands she had long since stopped noticing, she saw him in the corner of her eye, pacing the floor again, muttering under his breath. He wasn't even aware of her watching him. Tasha had grown used to his anxious presence, but today, she could see something in his face that wasn't there before. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes darting around like a man who was running out of time. She didn't need to ask what was wrong. Ethan was always like this when things were going bad. The pressure weighed on him like a stone around his neck. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled again, and there he was, Mr. Carter, appearing just as quietly as before. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to see him again, but now that he was here, she found herself feeling uncertain. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because of the weight of his last words, or maybe it was because the unease in her own life had grown too loud to ignore. Whatever it was, she found herself watching him more closely this time. He seemed different somehow, a little more purposeful maybe. His slow, deliberate steps carried a sense of quiet authority that she hadn't noticed before. He moved through the store with the same careful attention to detail, his fingers brushing against the fabrics as though searching for something. The usual indifference of the other customers was absent in him. There was no hesitation in his movements. Tasha watched him closely as he approached a display of leather jackets, each one more expensive than the last. This time, he didn't ask for the price. He simply studied the jackets, running his fingers over the fine leather as if judging the worth of each piece based on something other than its tag. Ethan, noticing Mr. Carter once again, stiffened. He didn't want to deal with another curious, non-buying customer, not today. But there was something different about Mr. Carter's presence this time. He didn't know what it was, but something in the air had shifted. Mr. Carter wasn't just browsing anymore, he was observing. "Can I help you with anything?" Ethan asked, trying to mask the impatience in his voice. Mr. Carter didn't immediately respond. He was still examining a jacket, tilting his head as though considering its value on a level that went beyond its cost. Finally, he looked up at Ethan. "I've been in and out of places like this all my life," Mr. Carter said, his voice low and steady. "I've seen businesses like this one rise and fall. The problem, is not that people don't know the value of things. It's that they forget to ask what the price of respect is." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his instinct to dismiss the old man flaring up, but something about the way Mr. Carter spoke made him pause. There was a weight in those words, something familiar yet foreign, that made him uncomfortable. But Ethan didn't want to admit that. So he shrugged it off, forcing a smile. "I'm not sure I follow," Ethan said, trying to remain professional but his tone barely hiding his frustration. "What exactly are you getting at?" Mr. Carter took a step back from the jacket and faced him fully. He didn't seem bothered by Ethan's dismissiveness. Instead, there was a quiet wisdom in his eyes that almost made Ethan feel small. "I'm not trying to teach you a lesson, son. I'm just reminding you that there's more to this than selling overpriced jackets to people who think they're buying something better than they are." Mr. Carter's words lingered in the air, hanging heavy between them. Ethan opened his mouth to reply but stopped himself, the words catching in his throat. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned his choices, but it was the first time someone like Mr. Carter had made him feel seen. Not judged for his success or failure in the store, but something deeper. He hadn't been asked to reflect on himself in a long time, and he didn't like the feeling of vulnerability that crept up on him. Meanwhile, Tasha, who had been quietly watching from a distance, felt an unexpected wave of something stir inside her. She hadn't known what to make of Mr. Carter before, but now she felt it. The calm in his presence, the way he spoke without needing to be heard, the way he seemed to look straight through all the pretenses of the store. His words weren't just aimed at Ethan. They were aimed at all of them, at the whole system they were part of. Mr. Carter turned away, but not before giving Tasha a brief glance. His eyes seemed to say, "You know what I mean," before he began walking toward the back of the store, his cane tapping on the floor with each slow step. Tasha watched him leave, but this time she didn't feel the need to follow him, to ask him what he meant, to try to piece together his cryptic words. She had an odd feeling, as though something inside her had shifted just enough to make her see the world around her differently. The store, the endless cycle of consumerism, the sales targets, the pressure. It all seemed somehow irrelevant now, as though Mr. Carter's presence had cracked open a window to something much more meaningful. As the door chime rang, signaling his departure, she glanced over at Ethan, who was now standing with his arms crossed, staring after Mr. Carter. His face was a mask of confusion, but beneath it, there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. Was it guilt, regret? She wasn't sure. But for the first time she realized that maybe she wasn't the only one who was stuck. Maybe, like the store itself, they were all waiting for someone to break the cycle. Tasha returned to her work, but this time the weight of Mr. Carter's presence still lingered. His words echoed in her mind. What is the price of respect? She didn't know the answer, not yet, but she knew, in some quiet corner of her heart, that she was about to find out. The store felt quieter after Mr. Carter left. Even the air seemed to still, as if holding its breath. Tasha stood at the counter for a long moment, her mind spinning with the things he had said. She had always dismissed the deeper meanings of life, the philosophical stuff that people tossed around like a way to avoid real problems. To her, it was all just a distraction. But somehow, Mr. Carter's words had slipped past the walls she had built around herself, and now she couldn't shake them. The price of respect. What did that even mean? And why did she feel like it was something she should be thinking about? Ethan, on the other hand, had not processed anything in quite the same way. His thoughts were consumed by the escalating pressure from corporate. The next few days would determine the store's fate and his own. The words Mr. Carter had spoken, though undoubtedly profound, felt like a nuisance to him. He was trying to keep the business afloat, juggling numbers, meeting sales targets, all while trying to keep up appearances. Philosophical musings about respect were luxuries he didn't have the time for. His mind was far more concerned with his dwindling options and the looming threat of the store's closure. He had done everything he could. He had run all the numbers. He had worked all the hours. If things didn't improve soon, he knew the next phone call from corporate would be the final one. Yet, despite his attempts to push Mr. Carter's words out of his mind, they kept circling back. The price of respect. The following day, something unexpected happened. The store was busier than usual, a stream of customers filtering through the doors, all of them looking for deals, hoping to catch something they could show off to friends or on social media. Tasha, still distracted by the lingering effects of Mr. Carter's visit, moved mechanically behind the counter, answering questions with the same rehearsed responses. But her mind kept returning to those words. "Excuse me, miss," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see a well-dressed woman standing at the counter, a smile stretched across her face. "I'm looking for something special, a gift, but nothing too flashy." Tasha blinked, momentarily thrown off by the request. She hadn't expected anyone to ask for something understated in a store like this. People came here for the luxury, the status, to find something that would make them look better than everyone else. "I think I can help with that," Tasha said, her voice almost absent, still preoccupied by her internal battle. She walked over to a display of understated, elegant scarves, nothing too extravagant but still high quality. She picked one up, examining it, but then she noticed something strange. A price tag. A $500 price tag on a scarf that, on any other day, she would have glanced at and moved on. But now, with Mr. Carter's words echoing in her head, the number seemed absurd. The price of respect, she thought again. What was it really that made a scarf worth $500? She turned back to the woman and handed her the scarf, a little too distracted to give the usual sales pitch. "Does this one feel right?" she asked, her words almost out of her control. The woman smiled, but there was something in her expression, something that made Tasha pause. The woman looked down at the scarf and back at Tasha with a knowing look. "It's beautiful," she said slowly. "But I can't help but wonder if I'm buying it for the right reasons." Tasha's brow furrowed. The woman's words struck a chord. She hadn't expected a customer to question her purchase like this. Most customers were just checking off a box, seeking validation through status symbols. But this woman, there was something different about her. She wasn't just looking for something to wear, she was looking for meaning. Before Tasha could respond, the woman picked up the scarf and gave a small, almost self-deprecating laugh. "You know, maybe I'm just feeling tired of all the stuff. There's so much stuff out there. But what does it really mean?" Tasha had no answer. In fact, she felt uncomfortably exposed. She had never thought about it that way, about how much of her life was spent on acquiring things, on fulfilling an unspoken need for something she didn't even understand, something that probably didn't matter as much as she thought. "Well," the woman continued, her voice suddenly lighter, "maybe I'll just hold off today. I'll take my time and think about it." Tasha nodded, feeling the weight of the conversation linger. The woman smiled and left the store, and Tasha was left holding the scarf in her hands, her thoughts more jumbled than ever. Later that evening, when the store finally closed, Ethan was still at his desk, hunched over his laptop, eyes bloodshot and tired. The numbers were still bad, worse than he had hoped. A phone call from corporate had only added to his stress, leaving him with a sense of impending doom. He could feel the walls closing in, could already hear the words they'd say to him. "We've given you plenty of time, Ethan. We can't afford another quarter like this." But then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, expecting it to be another reminder of the company's crushing demands. Instead, it was a text from his ex-girlfriend. It had been months since they'd spoken, but her message was simple. "I think we both deserve a fresh start." His heart lurched. That was all she had said. A fresh start. The words hit harder than he expected. He knew he had messed up the relationship, that his work had consumed him, that he had neglected the things that actually mattered. But now, reading her message, he felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. He had spent so much of his life focused on getting ahead, on achieving success, that he hadn't stopped to think about what was really important. The price of respect, he thought, remembering Mr. Carter's words. Ethan didn't know why he had recalled them now, but they seemed to haunt him. Was this what it felt like to realize you had lost something vital and didn't know how to get it back? Was this the cost of his ambition, his obsession with being the best? He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the glow of his computer screen reflecting in his eyes. He didn't know the answer, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he wanted to keep searching for it in all the wrong places. Tasha sat at the counter long after everyone had gone, the empty store echoing her thoughts. Her phone lay in front of her, a notification from her bank flashing across the screen. Another bill, another reminder of the life she was barely holding on to. But instead of swiping past it as she usually did, she stopped. For the first time, she really looked at the number on the screen and thought about what it represented. It wasn't just another deadline, it was another moment, another choice. What kind of person did she want to be? Someone who kept trying to buy her way out of her problems? Or someone who faced them head-on without pretending they didn't matter? She thought about Mr. Carter again. What was he trying to teach her? Was it possible to change? To stop chasing after the things that had no real meaning, just because the world told her they were important? As she turned off the lights and locked the door behind her, Tasha couldn't help but feel like she was standing at the edge of something new. Something uncertain, but real. She didn't know where it would take her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might actually be ready to find out. The next morning came with a sharp clarity that Tasha wasn't used to. The usual fog that clouded her thoughts seemed to lift, if only slightly. It wasn't that she had figured everything out overnight, far from it. But for the first time, she found herself questioning the path she had been on. Her eyes fell on the clock as she prepared to leave her apartment. But instead of rushing out the door like usual, she paused. The question had been planted in her mind, and now it bloomed in full. What was the price of respect? Was it simply about money, success, the designer clothes she folded daily at the store? Or was there something deeper, something more intrinsic? And if so, how did she go about finding it when everything around her seemed to demand the opposite? Her phone buzzed with a reminder to clock in, and she shook her head as if to clear it. There were bills to pay, groceries to buy, routines to follow. But now, in the midst of those mundane tasks, a quiet voice kept asking, "What am I really living for?" When she arrived at the store, it was already buzzing with activity, despite the early hour. Ethan was pacing back and forth in the office as usual, but today he seemed even more frenetic, his face tight with anxiety. He hadn't even noticed her come in, too absorbed in a phone call with someone from corporate. Tasha barely acknowledged him. Instead, she moved to her station, her mind distant. As the morning wore on, more customers trickled in. Most were regulars, people who bought expensive things without thinking too hard about them. People who viewed shopping as a way to fill a hole they didn't know how to fix. They weren't here for meaning. They were here for escape. A couple of hours into the shift, Tasha saw him again. Mr. Carter. He walked into the store slowly, but this time he didn't go to the coats or the jackets. He didn't even look at the scarves. He went straight for the small section of books they had near the back. Self-help, wellness, biographies of rich entrepreneurs. It was an odd corner, a part of the store that was rarely noticed. The kind of books that no one really read, but everyone liked to pretend they might someday. Tasha couldn't help herself. She watched him for a moment, the same curiosity that had gripped her the first time he walked in, pulling her toward him now. But this time, it wasn't the coat he was looking at. It was something entirely different. He was standing still, his hands resting lightly on a worn, leather-bound book, his eyes scanning the cover as if it held the answers to something deep within him. This wasn't the same man who had asked for the price of scarves or jackets. This was someone searching for something. Ethan, noticing Mr. Carter, made his way over with forced enthusiasm, his smile tight. "Sir, can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice sharp as he adjusted his tie. trying to maintain the facade of professionalism. Mr. Carter looked up from the book, his gaze steady. "I'm just looking," he said simply, not moving away. Ethan chuckled awkwardly, as if trying to smooth over the awkward silence. "We have plenty of things on sale today. Not that you'd be interested, I guess." His attempt at humor fell flat, and the silence between them deepened. Mr. Carter smiled, the smallest curve of his lips. But it wasn't a smile that held any real warmth. It was a smile that spoke of understanding, of seeing the world through a lens of experience that Ethan couldn't possibly comprehend. "You're trying to sell something I don't need," Mr. Carter said, his voice quiet but firm. Ethan's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he recovered quickly. "I'm not sure I follow." The older man didn't explain further. Instead, he simply turned back to the book in his hands. "It's all just a game, isn't it?" he muttered almost to himself. "Sell things to make people believe they need them. They chase, they buy, they wear. But at the end of it, they're still chasing something that's gone." Tasha's heart skipped a beat as she heard those words. Still chasing something that's gone. It felt like a punch in the gut, the truth of it striking deep inside her. How many times had she spent her days chasing after something, whether it was the next sale, the next paycheck, or the next thing that would fill the hole in her life? She hadn't even realized she had moved until she was standing beside Mr. Carter, looking at the same book he held. It was a biography of a famous tech mogul, someone who had built a billion-dollar empire from the ground up. A rags-to-riches story, the kind that had always fascinated her in the past. "I used to want this," she said without thinking, her words coming out in a rush. "I used to think that if I could just get to the top, if I could have the money, the status, everything would make sense. I thought I'd finally be happy." Mr. Carter glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "And do you think they were happy?" he asked, his voice steady. Tasha hesitated, a flicker of doubt creeping into her chest. "I don't know," she said finally, "but they always seemed like they had everything, like they had it all figured out." "Let me tell you something," Mr. Carter said, his voice low but intense. "You can have all the things you want, but that's not what makes you whole. You can be rich, you can be successful, but if you don't know who you are, truly know who you are, then you'll always be empty inside. Always." Tasha didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure what to make of the man who had appeared in her life so suddenly, with his cryptic words and quiet wisdom. But something inside her stirred, a realization she hadn't been ready for but knew she couldn't ignore anymore. Ethan, who had been listening from a distance, finally stepped forward, trying to break the tension. "You can't expect everyone to live like you, sir," he said, his voice defensive. "The world doesn't work that way. People want success, they want to buy things. They need to feel like they're moving up." Mr. Carter gave a soft laugh, but it wasn't mocking. It was resigned, as if he had heard this argument too many times before. "And where does that leave them when the new thing wears off?" he asked, not looking at Ethan, but at Tasha. "What do they do when the new car, the new house, the new coat don't fill that emptiness anymore?" Tasha didn't have an answer. She didn't even know if she could find one, but she felt something shift in her chest. She had always believed that the answers lay in the things she could see, tangible things like money, possessions, achievements. But Mr. Carter was showing her that perhaps the real answers were elsewhere, within herself, beyond the material. He paused for a moment as if considering his next words carefully. "You don't have to live this way, you know. You can make a choice. You can choose to stop chasing things that don't matter, but only if you're brave enough to ask yourself what really does." And with that, he turned and began to walk toward the door, his cane tapping softly against the floor. Tasha stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Was this the change she had been waiting for? The shift that would allow her to finally stop running in circles, chasing something that could never satisfy her? As the door closed behind him, she glanced at Ethan. For a brief second, their eyes met. He looked just as lost as she felt, his face lined with frustration, but something else there too. Was it a flicker of recognition, or maybe a question he hadn't quite formulated yet? But whatever it was, Tasha knew that things had changed. Something had shifted. The question now wasn't just about what she was chasing. It was about what she was going to do next. And she had no idea what the answer was. But for the first time, she felt like she was finally ready to find out. The next few days felt like they were moving in slow motion for Tasha. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the weight of the questions Mr. Carter had planted in her mind were becoming a constant companion. She couldn't escape them, not even in the quiet moments before bed, when she used to numb herself with distractions. The question kept echoing, "What am I really living for?" At the store, the usual rhythm continued. Ethan remained buried in his numbers, obsessively checking inventory reports, fidgeting with sales targets, and trying his best to keep up the appearance of normalcy. His usual energy, the frantic kind that kept him running in circles, was still there, but Tasha could see through it now. There was an exhaustion in his eyes that mirrored her own. He wasn't just managing the store anymore. He was managing his fear of failure, fear of letting everything slip through his fingers. But what could he do? The store was on life support, and corporate wasn't going to throw him a lifeline unless he could show a significant uptick in sales. He had tried everything: discounts, promotions, loyalty programs, but nothing was sticking. And now, with the looming threat of an audit, the pressure was becoming unbearable. Ethan was trapped in a cycle he didn't know how to break. Tasha couldn't help but feel a strange sense of solidarity with him. She didn't have the answers either, but something had shifted in her. She was no longer willing to just keep moving through the motions, pretending like everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. And that realization made her more aware of the cracks in her own life, cracks that she had spent years covering up with new clothes, new gadgets, and empty accomplishments. On the third day, after Mr. Carter's visit, the store was nearly empty in the late afternoon. Tasha was folding sweaters, the repetitive motion allowing her mind to wander. She hadn't heard much from Ethan all day. He had locked himself in the back office to go over the latest sales figures. She wasn't sure if he was avoiding her, or if he was just so consumed by his own stress that he couldn't see past it. But either way, the tension between them had thickened. She could feel it every time their eyes met, as if they were both trying to figure out if they were going to acknowledge the elephant in the room. The doorbell chimed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She looked up, expecting another customer, but it wasn't a customer at all. It was Mr. Carter. For a moment, Tasha froze, the familiar stirrings of curiosity and unease rushing over her. She had been expecting him to return, though she didn't quite know why. There was something about him, something that drew her in, something that made her believe he had answers to questions she hadn't even known how to ask. He walked into the store slowly, just as he always did. His cane tapped with a rhythmic precision, the sound grounding the space in a strange stillness. As he moved deeper into the store, Tasha felt an odd sense of anticipation building in her chest. He didn't head toward the displays this time. He moved straight toward the back, where Ethan's office was, the one place that no one ever dared to go. "Mr. Carter, can I help you?" Tasha called, instinctively stepping forward. But Mr. Carter didn't stop. His eyes were fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. He was on a mission, and nothing would divert him from it. "Just a moment," he muttered over his shoulder, his voice low but certain. Tasha stood still for a moment, stunned by his sudden boldness. She glanced toward Ethan's office, where she could see the faint outline of his silhouette through the frosted glass. He was hunched over, oblivious to Mr. Carter's presence. Without thinking, Tasha followed. When she reached the door, she hesitated. She knew that crossing this boundary meant breaking the unspoken rule, the one that had always kept things separate, professional, even if everything else felt fragmented. But Mr. Carter didn't seem like someone who cared about rules, and for some reason, neither did Tasha. She pushed open the door without knocking. Inside, Ethan looked up, his face momentarily caught in a flash of surprise, then irritation. But before he could speak, Mr. Carter entered the office with quiet authority. Tasha didn't know how he managed to command the space, but he did. The old man was not intimidated, not even by the sight of Ethan, who, despite all his frantic energy, was momentarily taken aback by the intrusion. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Mr. Carter raised a hand, silencing him. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice measured but cutting. Ethan frowned, confused. "What do you mean by that?" "I've seen your struggle. Seen you work yourself into the ground chasing numbers that won't save you," Mr. Carter replied calmly, his gaze unwavering. "I've seen you dance to a tune that's been written by others. But what if I told you that it doesn't have to be this way?" Tasha shifted uncomfortably behind Mr. Carter, the tension thick in the air. She had no idea what was happening, or why this man seemed so determined to reach Ethan, but something in his voice made her pause. For a brief moment, it was as if the room had grown quieter, more focused, as if all of their unspoken thoughts were swirling in the space between them. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, his usual bravado faltering. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, his voice defensive. "You don't know what it's like to have everything on the line. The pressure, the targets. I can't just throw it all away. This is my job, my life. You can't just waltz in here and tell me." "I'm not telling you to throw anything away," Mr. Carter interrupted gently, his tone almost too calm for the storm swirling around them. "I'm telling you to stop being so afraid of losing it, because you're already losing yourself." Tasha felt her breath catch in her throat. She didn't know why, but those words seemed to cut through everything she had been feeling, everything she had been avoiding. Was that what was wrong with her too? Was she just as trapped by her own fears, by the need to prove something, by the constant chase for validation? Ethan's face tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might snap back, might say something angry and dismissive. But then something in Mr. Carter's steady gaze seemed to hold him in place. Ethan's shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time Tasha saw the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability that he had been hiding so well. "You think I don't know that?" Ethan's voice was quieter now, tinged with frustration and something deeper. "You think I don't know what I'm sacrificing? You think I don't feel it every single day?" Mr. Carter nodded, his expression softening for a moment. "I think you're afraid to look at it, to really face it, but it's not too late, son. It never is." The words hung in the air between them. Tasha stood still, unsure if she should say something, if she should intervene, but she couldn't. She felt as though she were witnessing something too personal to interrupt. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just observing from the sidelines. She was a part of this. She was part of this conversation, part of this struggle. Ethan finally looked down, his hands clenching into fists on the desk, his breath shallow. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Maybe you're right," he muttered, almost to himself. "Maybe I've been looking at it all wrong." Mr. Carter smiled, but it wasn't a victory smile. It was the kind of smile that came from understanding, from knowing how hard it was to admit a truth you had spent your whole life avoiding. "I'm not here to fix you, Ethan," he said softly. "I'm just here to remind you that there's another way, a way that doesn't depend on the things you think matter." The weight of those words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, both Ethan and Tasha found themselves speechless. As Mr. Carter turned to leave, his cane tapping against the floor, he paused just before exiting. "Remember," he said, glancing back over his shoulder, "the price of respect isn't what you think it is, it's what you're willing to give." And with that, he walked out of the office, leaving the two of them in silence. Tasha and Ethan stood there for a long while, neither knowing what to say, neither knowing where this would lead. But somehow, for the first time, the weight of the world felt a little lighter. The store seemed different after Mr. Carter left. Not in any dramatic, tangible way. Everything was still the same. The same gleaming shelves, the same racks of overpriced clothing. But there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the first hint of dawn breaking through the darkness. For the first time in a long while, Tasha felt a kind of quiet anticipation hanging in the air, as if the walls of the store, the very space they inhabited, were waiting for something to change. Tasha didn't know what that change would look like. She couldn't predict it, but she felt it, like a steady thrum beneath her feet. She wasn't the only one who had been affected by Mr. Carter's visit. She could see it in Ethan, too. He hadn't said much after the old man left, just locked himself back in his office, likely to continue wrestling with his spreadsheets and the mounting pressure from corporate. But something in his posture had shifted. He wasn't as rigid as before. He wasn't quite so frantic. The tension that had weighed on both of them for so long was still there, but now it was tempered by something else. Uncertainty, yes, but also possibility. The following day, Ethan did something he hadn't done in a long time. He asked Tasha to join him for coffee. It wasn't much, just a simple invitation, but the shift in his tone was enough to make Tasha pause. She had grown used to his cold efficiency, his occasional sharp remarks when the pressure of the store was too much for him to handle. But this was different. He wasn't asking her to talk numbers or sales targets. He was asking her to sit with him, to be present, if only for a moment. They walked to a small cafe down the block, a quiet place that neither of them had visited in a while. The low hum of conversation and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but for the first time, neither of them felt the need to rush. They found a corner table, the kind that was tucked away from the main flow of customers, and sat in silence for a few moments. "I don't know why I'm doing this," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice wasn't defensive or rushed. It was almost like he was trying to process something out loud. "I've spent my whole life just going, keeping my head down, working the grind. I thought if I just pushed harder, kept going, eventually I'd get to where I wanted to be. But I've been chasing something I don't even know the name of." Tasha was quiet for a moment. She hadn't expected him to open up like this. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, letting him continue. "I've been so caught up in all this, my stuff," Ethan continued, his fingers absently stirring his coffee. "The numbers, the sales, the next bonus. I've made it all my life. And I thought if I could make enough, I'd finally feel fulfilled, Tasha nodded again, her mind flashing back to Mr. Carter's words. The price of respect. The things we chase and why we never feel full. She hadn't realized how much she had been chasing the same things. Maybe it wasn't about money or status, but maybe, just like Ethan, she had been trying to fill an empty space inside her, a space she didn't know how to name. "But," Ethan went on, his voice quieter now, "I guess I'm starting to see that it's not about getting the next promotion. It's not about getting another trophy or another sale. It's about something else. Something I can't even put into words." Tasha met his eyes then, and for the first time, they were on the same page. He was searching just like she had been. They had both been caught in the same cycle, running after things they couldn't even identify, because it was all they had known. "What if," she started carefully, unsure of how to frame her thoughts, "what if the thing we've been chasing isn't real? What if we've spent so much time running after this idea that we've lost sight of what's actually important?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she admitted, feeling the weight of her own words. "I think I've been chasing something too. I've always believed that the next thing, the next sale, the next piece of clothing, the next whatever, would fix something inside me. But I don't think it works that way. And I don't think it works that way for you either." Ethan stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "You're saying we're both lost?" "I think we're both just looking in the wrong places," she said softly. He looked down at his coffee, the steam curling in the air. "I don't know how to stop," he confessed. "I've been so focused on getting ahead, on keeping up appearances, that I've forgotten what it even means to be content, to feel okay with where I am." Tasha's heart ached for him in that moment. She could see the weight of his struggles, the pressure he had carried for so long, and she felt the same pressure, but for different reasons. It was all so complicated, and neither of them knew how to untangle it. "I think," Tasha said slowly, We both need to figure out what really matters, not just for the store, but for ourselves. If we keep running this race without even knowing why we're in it, we'll just burn out." Ethan didn't respond at first. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his hand running through his hair, looking almost lost. But after a long pause, he nodded. "I don't know if I can just stop," he said quietly, as though admitting something he hadn't allowed himself to say before. "But I think I need to try." The rest of their conversation was quieter, filled with more silences than words. But for the first time in a long time, Tasha felt like she wasn't alone in this. They weren't just co-workers caught in a system that wanted to consume them. They were two people, two flawed, tired, and uncertain people, trying to find their way back to something real. The days that followed felt different. Not easy, not magically solved, but different. Tasha couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Ethan, and she couldn't stop thinking about the change that seemed to be quietly happening in both of them. The store, too, was in a kind of limbo. Corporate's demands were still there, their deadlines still hanging over Ethan's head like a sword. But the frantic push for sales, the endless juggling of numbers and quotas, seemed a little less urgent now. It was as if both of them had realized something important, that the real problem wasn't the store itself, but the way they had been running it. Maybe the store wasn't the problem at all. Maybe it was the way they had let the store become the measure of everything in their lives, the measure of their worth, their success, their purpose. Ethan was quieter now, less reactive. There were still moments of stress, still days when the weight of everything got to be too much. But Tasha noticed the subtle shift. He was no longer so consumed by the idea of control. He wasn't trying to hold on to the fleeting things. Instead, he was looking for something more meaningful. And Tasha, she was starting to look too. She wasn't sure what she was looking for exactly, but for the first time she didn't feel like she was just going through the motions. For the first time in years, she was ready to let go of the chase. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect. But at least for now, they were both finally asking the right questions. And that was enough to start something new. The change in the air was undeniable. It wasn't as dramatic as Ethan or Tasha might have expected, but it was real. The frantic energy that had once defined the store had settled into something more measured, more intentional. There were still bad days, days when the numbers didn't add up, when the corporate pressure built to an unbearable crescendo, when Ethan's anxiety flared, or when Tasha caught herself slipping back into old habits. But there was also something new, a kind of steadiness, a willingness to face the discomfort, to stop running, even if they didn't know where they were heading yet. Tasha found herself standing in the store one evening, as the sun dipped low outside, casting a golden hue through the glass windows. She was organizing the displays, but her mind was elsewhere. It had been a week since that coffee with Ethan, and she felt a shift within herself. She was starting to ask the hard questions, the ones she had spent years avoiding. What did she really want? What did she truly value? Was it the lifestyle, the clothes, the success that came with those things? Or was there something more, something deeper that she had been neglecting all these years? The bell above the door jingled, and she glanced up, expecting a customer. But it wasn't just anyone. It was Mr. Carter again. He walked in slowly, his cane tapping rhythmically on the floor, his eyes scanning the store, not with judgment, but with quiet observation. Tasha smiled slightly, a sense of warmth spreading through her chest. There was something about him that felt reassuring, like a guide on a path she wasn't sure she even wanted to walk, but felt drawn to anyway. "Mr. Carter," she greeted him, her voice calm but curious. "What brings you back?" He smiled back, the lines on his face deepening as if he had all the time in the world. "I was in the neighborhood," he said softly. "But also I had a feeling I'd find you here." Tasha was silent for a moment, taking in his words, wondering what exactly he meant by that. She had been thinking about him for days now, not because she had any grand revelations, but because his words had stayed with her. His advice had sunk deeper into her consciousness than she had expected. And now, in this moment, she realized how much she had been holding on to things that didn't really matter. "What have you been thinking about?" Mr. Carter asked, his voice as gentle as ever. Tasha looked down at the sweater she was folding, as if the fabric could give her the answer. "I've been thinking about how much time I've wasted running after things that don't really mean anything. I've been trying to figure out who I am without all of this," she said, waving vaguely around the store. "Without the clothes, the labels, the expectations. I think I've been afraid to find out what's left when you strip all that away." Mr. Carter's eyes softened, and he stepped closer. "I think you've taken the first step. Asking the right questions is the beginning of the journey." "And where does it go from here?" Tasha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't even realized how much she needed guidance until this moment. He smiled again, but this time, there was a touch of something deeper in his expression. "It goes wherever you choose to take it. But the path is not a straight line. It twists and turns, and it's never easy. You may stumble, you may fall, but you have to decide to keep walking even when the path isn't clear. There's no map for this kind of journey. But trust yourself. You'll find your way." Tasha felt a lump form in her throat as his words settled deep inside her. It was terrifying, the thought of walking into the unknown without any guarantees. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't need them yet. What mattered now was simply the act of beginning. As Mr. Carter turned to leave, he paused by the door, glancing back at her. "Remember," he said, his voice low but firm, "the price of respect is not what you take, but what you give. And you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You just need to be true to yourself." Tasha nodded, a sense of peace settling over her as the door clicked shut behind him. The weight of the world still felt heavy at times, but now she understood that it wasn't about carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. It was about finding a way to stand, to walk, to exist with her own truth. As she stood there, the evening light warming her skin, Tasha realized that the path was never about a final destination. It was about the journey, and she was ready to begin. Ethan, who had been in the back office dealing with yet another mountain of paperwork, emerged from behind the curtain. He had overheard part of the conversation but didn't interrupt. He wasn't sure what he expected from Tasha, or from himself for that matter, but when their eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding between them. "I think I'm starting to get it," he said, his voice thoughtful. "What Mr. Carter was talking about." Tasha smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "I think we both are." The next few days passed in a quiet sort of rhythm. There were still problems, of course. There always would be. Sales figures didn't magically improve overnight, and corporate pressures didn't vanish because Tasha and Ethan had a few meaningful conversations. But something had shifted in both of them. They were no longer trapped by the idea of chasing success at any cost. They were learning to listen, to themselves, to each other, and to the quiet truth that life wasn't just about what you could accumulate, but about what you could give. Ethan made the difficult decision to let go of some of the more frivolous promotions, the constant discounting, and instead focused on creating a space that felt more authentic, more aligned with what he now understood. People didn't just want things, they wanted meaning, connection, and real value. He worked with Tasha to rethink the store's identity. It was a slow process, but every day they took one step closer to something more fulfilling, more real. One evening, after closing time, they stood together in the store, taking in the space they had created. The atmosphere felt different now, more alive, more genuine. Tasha glanced at Ethan, and for the first time, they shared a smile that wasn't about escaping the pressure or avoiding the truth, but about embracing it. "I think we're on the right path," she said softly. Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "I think we are." And as the days turned into weeks, the store began to feel like more than just a place to buy things. It became a space for people to pause, to reflect, and to reconsider what they truly valued. The pressure to succeed had not disappeared, but it was no longer the driving force behind every decision. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that true success wasn't measured by what they sold, but by what they gave, what they shared, and what they were willing to give up in order to be true to themselves. Mr. Carter's words echoed in their minds, guiding them as they took each step forward, together. It had been months since Mr. Carter had walked into the store that day, and yet, Tasha still found herself thinking about him often. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. He hadn't returned since that conversation. But it didn't matter. His presence had left an indelible mark on her life. She no longer felt the need to chase an illusion. She was starting to understand that she already had everything she needed to move forward. The store was busier now, not because they had slashed prices or launched another sales event, but because something had changed in the air. People were drawn in, not by flashy advertisements, but by the sense of authenticity that now permeated the space. The energy was different. It felt like a place that understood you didn't need to prove your worth by buying things. You needed to prove it by how you showed up in the world, by what you gave. One afternoon, as Tasha was organizing the front display, she looked up to see an elderly man standing at the entrance of the store. He had a cane in hand and a gentle smile on his face. Tasha's heart skipped as she recognized him. It was Mr. Carter. He walked toward her slowly, his eyes twinkling with a knowing warmth. "I was wondering if you'd remember me," he said, his voice as steady and sure as ever. "I told you it wasn't about what you take but what you give. And I see now that you've given something real here." Tasha smiled, the weight of the world lifting as she realized that what she had been searching for had been here all along. It wasn't in the sale, or the number of customers, or the things on the shelves. It was in the simple act of being true, of giving, of sharing, of walking a path that didn't need to be proven by success, but by integrity. "I think I've figured it out," Tasha said quietly. "It's not about the price of anything. It's about what you're willing to give without expecting anything in return." Mr. Carter nodded, his smile softening. "You've got it, my dear. Now you're living the truth." And with that, he left. Tasha stood there, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just about the store anymore. It was about everything she had learned. About herself, about the world, and about the price of respect. And for the first time in years, she felt that she was exactly where she needed to be.